Copyright notice. You are free to download and copy this work in audio format for replay in any audio or video mode, and I encourage you to do so and enjoy and learn. You may redistribute it in a non-commercial fashion, that is, not for profit directly or indirectly. You may not sell or seek to profit from this publication in part or in whole, nor may you translate it into any written format for any purpose. Thank you. Chapter 19 of the E-novel, survival novel, When the Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Captured. Quietly and carefully I made my final approach, keeping a careful watch on the man whose back was partly to me. I was approaching nearly directly from behind, and the next few steps were going to be crucial. If he sensed me and then turned quickly to shoot, he would have the advantage of making the first move. I remember someone showing me the concept of lag time. He had me hold my thumb and finger, ready to catch a dollar bill between them, which he held vertically. He said if I could catch it without moving my arms, only using my fingers, I could have it. He let go of the dollar bill. I saw it fall, tried to close my fingers, and couldn't in time. He used this to teach the concept about initiative in a fight, and it was true. Now I was giving up the initiative in order to capture this man alive. It would have been easier, though, just to shoot him. As I moved, I thus kept my finger on the trigger, thumb on the safety, and flowed in on him. He sensed me more than anything, but he turned his head to look instead of reacting to the threat. Mistake on his part. In a flash, I was on him, jamming the barrel of my rifle into his face as I used my left foot to push the barrel of his rifle down and into the ground in one fluid motion. With his weapon out of the way, I turned my attention to the man, to his face and to his eyes, but also keeping his hands in view. "Hands on top of your head, slow and easy, mister," I said forcefully in a commanding voice. I saw a flicker in his eyes of anger. He was angry and alarmed, but I saw much more in those eyes. I also saw a bit of insanity, like the cracks in a flawed diamond. There was much going on behind those eyes, and none of it looked good. Something about this man was not right. It made me uneasy to be this close to him, and I was glad I had the business end of my rifle in his face. I had once met a man like this who was on death row in prison. I was there as a volunteer minister. He bragged to me about murdering a man, how much he enjoyed it. He shared details the way a sociopath would, assuming I was enjoying his story when I was actually nauseated. Suddenly I stood up and left the man in his cell. I too had killed before, but the thought of it brought me no pleasure, only nightmares. This man was pure trouble, evil trouble. I might as well have been riding on a tiger now, no way to get off without getting eaten. For an instant he hesitated, and a sneer curled across his lips. I thumped him just below his left eye with the barrel of my weapon, feeling the barrel hit his cheekbone, not hard enough to cause a serious injury, but definitely leaving a bruise. I needed him to weigh out his insanity with the reality of pain. He winced and also released the rifle as he tried to bring his hands up quickly to his face. I aimed directly at his left eye and rotated the safety switch to fire. The metallic clicking noise made a very precise, distinct, and clear statement to the man. His eyes returned to glare at me. That the man said nothing, asked nothing, told me that he knew he was guilty. He knew he was caught. "Are you the law?" he asked contemptuously. "'Cause if you are, I don't see no badge." He pursed his lips as if to spit, and then thought better of it when he felt me push the barrel against his face again. I asked, "You waiting for somebody?" His eyes looked right slightly, and he said, "Yeah, why?" I tapped him on the cheek with my rifle and said, "I'm asking the questions here, mister." He nodded when I continued, "Where's your pistol?" This time his eyes darted in the other direction, meaning he was going to lie, and he said, "I ain't got," and I interrupted him before he could finish. "Is it in your belt?" I looked over at the rucksack leaning against a tree and saw Eddie's rifle. The man followed my eyes, and before I could speak, he glanced to his left again and offered, "I found that rifle in the woods." I paused for a second and sucked my teeth and said, Right. He looked angrily at me and spat. "Who the hell are you, boy?" I wanted to know where he was from, so I wanted to know if he might have kin or friends close by, so I tapped him on the same spot under his eye hard, and he yelped a bit in pain. I asked, "You answer, got it?" He nodded, then looked right this time, and he said, "I live near Mars Hill." He told the truth on that one. We were a good piece off, but not far enough. I got a little twinge in the hair on the back of my neck as I thought someone might at this very moment be slithering up behind us. "What?" he started to ask another question, and the look in my eyes coupled with the slight movement of my rifle told him to not pursue that one further. I finished the question I thought he was going to ask. "I'm taking you back to town with me for the murders of Adolph Branson and Eddie Slavinsky." He looked me dead in the eye wickedly and said with a nasty grin, "Never heard of him." I stepped back off of the man, put my weapon on safe, but kept the barrel pointed at him and ordered him face down on the ground, nice and slow. He just sat there and said, "The hell you say?" I stepped up, swiftly rotated the weapon off of safe, shoved the rifle into his face, and then at the last second I swiveled it just past his right ear and beyond and squeezed the trigger. The noise was loud to me, and I know it surely was to him. I didn't bust his eardrum, but now he knew my rifle worked. He shrieked in pain and rolled onto his side, clutching at the side of his face. I used my foot to push him onto his stomach, then dropped down hard with my knee in between his shoulders. He let out a groan of pain. "Hey, you can't treat me like this. You're a cop." He spat out the word cop like it was a curse, which to him it probably was. His speech sounded off because he couldn't hear out of his right ear, so I spoke up for him. "I'm not a cop, mister. That cleared up any for you?" "Now put your hands out flat on the ground and don't move," I ordered. He did so a bit more quickly this time. I frisked him and found a revolver in his waistband, a .357 Smith & Wesson with a 4-inch barrel and rubber-type grips. I also found a hunting knife strapped to his right side. He was right-handed, it appeared, from the direction he had both weapons facing. I put the pistol into my belt and tossed the knife over by the rucksack. I told him, "Don't you move a muscle," and he obeyed, but I could tell he was watching and waiting for an opportunity. I walked somewhat sideways to the rucksack, never taking my eyes off of him, and dumped it on the ground. Inside I found a bag full of jewelry. I opened it up and there were several rings with blood on one of them. He also had several pairs of women's underwear. I looked at him with a hard look and he gave me a salacious smile and an evil grin. He was not only a murderer but probably a rapist too. My mind raced as I thought of the danger and difficulty in taking him back to town. It would be 2 days' walk minimum, and it would be longer for me because the prisoner, in this case, has an advantage. They can sleep when they are tired, but the guard must always keep a sort of eye on them. I had escorted a prisoner years ago when I was a chaser, taking him from Camp Pendleton in California to Camp Lejeune on the other coast, the other side of the country. I remembered being sleepy on the airplane and noting that I had to keep alert. The brig rat fell asleep, though. He slept like a baby. In retrospect, I should have nudged him awake, but he was only going to stand trial for a minor crime, not murder like this man would. In my chest rig, I had a set of flex cuffs, leftovers from my last tour downrange. My unit bought the reusable kind. They were more expensive, but they had advantages. I had all but forgotten about them. Now I would need them. They were essentially a heavy-duty zip tie or cable lock made of thick plastic. I told the man to put his hands behind his back, and he started to say something, but I said, no questions, and he slowly complied. "Spread your legs," I said. He did so a little slowly, and I took my right foot and brought it up swiftly, but just short of his testicles. Still, the nudge of the cloth on his inner legs was hard, and he jumped instinctively. This is a deliberate technique with a prisoner. It is to re-emphasize that you are in control and he is vulnerable. While he was focusing on his vulnerability, I safed my weapon and swiveled it around onto my back, dropping down a bit more gently this time with my knee in his lower back. "Hold still," I ordered, and he did not struggle as I put his hands into the zip ties and snugged them down. I didn't go too tight, although it was not out of kindness. I simply did not want to have to adjust the cuffs later. I went through the rucksack carefully now and then repacked it. There was a little bacon, and I knew where that had come from. Also some other things he had obviously stolen. None of this gear seemed to match, so to speak. I was quite disturbed by the amount of jewelry in his bag and the women's underwear as well. I took the man's AR-15. It was a nice one, and I asked, "You say this is yours?" The man said angrily, "Yes, that's what I said. You hard of hearing, boy?" I walked back behind him and moved my right foot hard against his inner leg, and he jumped again. "Nope, I'm just curious because I really like these weapons. Mine's made by Bushmaster. How about yours? Who made this one?" This was a Colt, but he stammered and said, "I don't remember." He stole this one apparently too. "What's your name, mister?" I asked, and he said, "Greg, but you can feel free to call me sir, boy." Apparently, as the pain wore off from his ear, Greg was getting a little cocky. I took note of this and knew that I was going to have a long 2 days journey back home with this one. "Hey, what did you do with my jewelry and all my girlfriend's panties?" Greg demanded sarcastically. I had noted that there were several different pair, and they were not the same size. The man was a rapist, I suspected, and his death, which I felt would be certain after some sort of a trial, would be a good thing for the world. I wasn't taking him back alive for his sake, though. Not for the sake of anyone else. I wasn't doing it even so much for God, although I knew this was what he wanted. I was doing this for me. I wanted to be different. I did not want to be the man I was in combat anymore. I wanted to beat the sword into a plowshare, so to speak, to do it in my own heart. I would take the man back to stand trial, for me, for my sanity. I stood the man up, shouldered his ruck, and marched him over to where my rucksack was, and had him lay face down on the ground again. I did not trust him even with the flex cuffs on. He was dangerous. I dumped his rucksack out and took most of the items and put them into mine. He grinned as I did this. When I finished, it was heavy, and he saw me lift it up with one hand to test the balance. He smirked, "That sure looks heavy," and I said, "You're right, Greg, it is." He smirked and said, "Yeah, I doubt you can carry it all the way, boy." I nodded and said, "You know, Greg, you got a point there. That's why you're going to carry it." He shook his head violently and said, "Hell no, you ain't going to make me carry that. Nope, that ain't going to happen. You can't make me." Wordlessly, I undid the shoulder straps and worked them through his trussed-up arms, rolled them over on his back, and tried to buckle the waistband, but he was too big around the middle. I told him, "Get up." With a smirk, he said, "I can't get up. You have to help me, boy." I put one hand into his belt, and with the other hand I grabbed him by the hair. He screamed, but amazingly he got up rather quickly. I wasn't the kind that liked to torment prisoners, but I had to let this one know he wasn't dealing with a weak-minded fool either. I gestured toward the north with my head. "You know the way." He looked at me stupidly as if to ask which. "We're going back to the place where the man with the bacon lived. The man you murdered, Greg. To my friend's house, Greg." His eyes lifted at that last one. Now he understood who I was. Now it was crystal clear. Still, defiantly, he said, "Oh, you mean the retard." On the way back, the man tried to get my goat. He told me ugly stories about the women he had raped, how they had been asking for it, how their screams excited him. He told me how he had killed men, how much it had given him a thrill, how he was going to kill me. I let him talk because I wanted him worn out and tired. I also know that if a man is talking like this, he's not able to concentrate, to cook up some kind of a plot, some kind of a plan. At some point, though, I was wishing for a bear. The more he said things, the more I was resolved less and less to take him back alive. He had killed well over 30 people by my count, and I was doing my best to remember it all so I could testify at his trial. I wished now I had a recorder, and when I got within range, I would turn the radio on and tell them to bring me one, but that wouldn't be until tomorrow. For now, I had to listen and try to not kill this piece of work. Then he told me a savage story about a woman, and I connected who it was. He told me of raping Linda, the woman who had come to us recently, whose husband had been murdered, the woman Kevin was now in love with. I knew it was her because of the circumstances, how she had told him to Jacqueline and I one evening, how with tears she asked us to pray for her, but also because I think she wanted us to know what had happened to her. The tears she had shed for Mark, as well as the trauma of being gang raped by this animal and his savage friends, made me wish I had a chance and a reason to kill him. This man deserved to die 1,000 horrible deaths. I regretted he had but one life to give, and that it hadn't been taken long ago. How many people had he ruined? How many had he murdered? "I got to take a leak," he announced suddenly in the middle of one of his stories. Damn it, I thought, realizing I had tied his hands behind his back, and now I would have to either hold it for him or untie him. I wasn't about to do the former, and was tempted to tell him to just urinate on himself, but didn't want to have to put up with the smell on top of all the foul stories he was spilling. "Hold up," I told him, and he did. I undid the side release buckles on the shoulder straps and eased the rucksack, allowing it to slide to the ground. I took my rifle and set it on top of the rucksack and drew out my .40, letting him hear the clack of it as I removed it from the holster. "Hold still," I commanded, and got out my tool to release the flex cuffs. It was difficult, but the cuffs came off. I watched his shoulders. They relaxed, so I did too. That was a mistake. He was on me in a flash, spinning before I could even squeeze the trigger. My shot went to the side, and his huge hands were engulfed around my wrists as he butted me in the face with his head. He was bigger than me, and I fell to the ground as his hands moved over the pistol. I'm strong, but he was using his weight now to try to rotate the weapon out of my hands. He got my right wrist bent backward and had both hands now on the weapon, jerking and twisting at the pistol violently. I could not let go of the weapon, though. I took my left foot and pressed it against his shin and drug my boot down hard against it, stomping on the top of his arch. I took the top of my head and slammed it into his right ear at the same time and succeeded in causing him to bleed. His right elbow came back and caught me on the side of the head, and I nearly blacked out from the power of the blow. It seemed to jar my teeth loose. My head spun a little bit, but I knew I had to hang on to the pistol and to keep my feet under me. He pulled hard and yanked me off balance and then pushed back and fell on top of me, nearly breaking my shoulder as he fell on my side with his full weight, cursing and threatening to kill me all the while. We were near a pile of slate that had once been part of a stone wall, and he smashed my hand onto one of these. My hand felt like it was broken. I lost the weapon, couldn't keep my hand on it. Fortunately, it fell into the stones, which at least kept him from getting it either. Now it would be hand to hand. He ran toward my rifle, and I was right behind him, knocking him to the ground. I had my knife out in a flash. I was going to kill him now. I didn't care that he was unarmed. My only focus was to win, and to do it quickly. I stabbed at him underhand, and he narrowly avoided the thrust as I maneuvered between the rucksack and him. He moved very quickly for his size. I knew that even without a knife, he was formidable. He tried to circle to my left, away from the knife hand, and I moved in on him, but then jumped back. I couldn't turn away enough to grab the weapon, but I couldn't let him get between me and that rifle either. Neither of us moved for a few seconds as we caught our breath. He was a bit winded, and the look on his face told me that he would kill me. He said between ragged breaths, "Are you scared, boy?" I said nothing, but waited for him to rush, watching his eyes, for they would warn me of it. His eyes opened wide for a second, and then he rushed me. My first instinct was to step aside, but then I realized that if I did, he would have my rifle. I held my ground instead, and he crouched, and I crouched to meet him back. I met his charge. We toppled back together onto the rucksack, and I grappled with him, throwing my legs around his waist and rolling us back and away from the rifle. He had done some fighting somewhere, because he was able to wind up on top of me and had both hands on my knife arm, pushing it away as he tried to pin me down. With his right knee, he pinned my left shoulder and arm and held my right hand down with his left and with his other leg. He took his right hand and smashed me in the face hard with his huge fist, drawing blood from my mouth. He reared back, and I focused on moving my head. It was a clever trick by him, because he quickly transferred both hands to my knife arm and wrenched my wrist back and got the knife. I got my arms out from under his knees, but by then he had the knife in his hands and held it poised over my chest and bore down with all his weight. Now, I'm strong, but I could see I could not forever hold his hand up. I watched the knife slowly descending toward my chest. Frantically, I swiveled my hips and slid down under him. Now my face was under the knife, and this seemed a bad move, but it freed up my legs, and I'm quite limber. I reached up with both feet and managed to get them hooked in front of his forehead before he knew what I was doing. He pulled backward with the knife and stabbed at me wildly, hitting me in the shin bone, causing me to shout in pain. Still, though, I jerked down with all my strength and slammed him backwards, head first into the ground. With all of my strength and all of my weight, I heard a satisfying thud. He was stunned, and I was up in a flash, but he rolled over and wrapped his hands around that knife. I turned and ran back the 15 feet or so and got my rifle. I was still off balance from the blows to my head and the wound in my leg. My vision was fuzzy and that intense pain in my shin. Still, the rifle fell into my hands smoothly. I was off balance a bit, but quickly I swiveled around to aim. I would kill him now. He had seen me run for the rifle and had decided to run himself in the opposite direction. I snapped a shot off and missed, just barely. I dropped to one knee to balance myself, drew a bead, and he zigged to the left and got a large maple tree between us. I jumped up to give chase, but my leg would not cooperate. I staggered to the tree and leaned against it in a Hawkins position, taking the weight of my leg off, but he was under cover by then. I fired nearly a dozen shots in the direction he had run. Normally, I could have run him down, but now I was bleeding and hurt. I went down the way he had come, slowly and gingerly on my bleeding leg. The pain was starting to take over, and I saw none of his blood, which meant I had not gotten lucky shooting blind. He had escaped, but now I knew what he looked like, knew where he was from. I'd find this man, and I would kill him somehow. Plans and operations. Walking briskly in the drizzle to the barn, Big Mike was doing his daily rounds to check on the plan. Late last night they had received copious amounts of encrypted data that he had downloaded and printed out, details on the target they would hit within days now. Mike had set a tentative date, and they had built a reverse planning schedule, and now he was making sure everyone followed it. He posted a copy of the schedule in various places. Most of the members had been on raids against rival gangs, and some of these were very serious, some quite lethal on both sides of the fence. This raid, though, was quite different. It was much bigger, and everyone had been given a warning order already that dialed them in on the nature, but not the location and exact date. Club discipline was unique in that it focused on some things and ignored others. A man, for instance, could get drunk, get into a fight, cuss, be sloppy, and all the things that the Army would have forbidden. Conversely, if you were given a mission, an order, or a timeline, you would pay hell, serious hell, if you failed. Big Mike noted nobody was smiling today. Everybody was busy trying to meet the schedule. Inside the barn, it was a madhouse. The generators and welders were running at full tilt, sucking down diesel fuel, but also producing the power to run the grinders, the cutters, and the fabrication tools. They'd need to move over 120 warriors to the south, and to do it in about a day. 18 vehicles now, 4 were tactical, and would have machine guns mounted on them, equipped with night vision goggles. The vehicles would have to fight their way through brutal terrain, but routes had been picked out and carefully marked with GPS locations by Dirty and the Snake. These were fed into GPS units inside the tactical vehicles, which would follow them within and drive up within machine gun range. Danny had called in the Quebec and New Hampshire chapters of the Fallen, and they each had an M60 machine gun and a dozen men to provide. They had not done so well lately, but had managed to keep a core of members alive and operating, mostly doing looting and robbing. Low-level stuff, but still it kept them fed and in fuel. Danny and Mike had begun the plan already. The recon had been arranged and made. The warning order was issued now, and now it was time to complete the plan, to issue the order, and to supervise. Some people were conflicted about using their military training when they became civilians. Mike never was, and Danny was glad for it. It had made the club successful and quite wealthy, and now might provide them with a future. A way out of this current catastrophe that was eating up the whole world. Greaseball came over to Big Mike and gave him a thumbs up. "Everything's solid, brother," he stated confidently. "Ahead of schedule, gives me time to triple check it all." He took Big Mike on a quick tour because he knew the man was all about checking details. When all was done, he returned to the big house where he and Danny hammered out final details. They would complete the plan tonight and do rehearsals tomorrow morning. Mike had a sand table set up outside. The sand table was actually a huge area he had marked off with ropes and parachute cord and grids in a sandy area behind the house where the kids sometimes played. The grids represented grid squares, kilometer, square kilometer, and inside of this he carefully made terrain features that resembled the target area based off old aerial photographs. He then marked roads with spray paint, buildings with blocks of wood, etc. He did his best to represent every terrain feature inside the target area, but also outside, especially the assembly points. He knew that the best way to ensure success was to have everybody understand exactly what was going on around them. The defenders always had a huge advantage because for them, the terrain and layout were well known and established, or could be easily. They already occupied it. The attackers had the disadvantage, especially if they were coming in cold, coming in at night, like the fallen would be. They would issue the order and then walk everyone through on the sand table. He made it large enough so people could walk through it, could actually stand on it and see. He would make everyone do a rock drill and show to their section leaders that they knew precisely what their task was and where they were to be at each time. The Fallen's members were good at this. They may look a ragtag bunch, but when it came down to it, they were pros. They would need everything they had and more for the mission ahead. We own the night. Moving silently through the woods like shadows, Joshua and Clarence also moved slowly. Not just because of the immense weight they carried with body armor, rucksacks, weapons, and ammo, but also so they could be sure not to wander into an ambush. Despite the cool evening air on their faces, sweat ran down their backs and brows. It was just past dark, and the two had held up for the day in a copse of trees off the beaten path. Not even animals seemed to want to enter that tangle that was swollen with black flies so thick they could scarcely breathe without covering their heads in their extra t-shirts. Clarence had still been chewed on quite a bit and was showing signs of being swollen around the face. The two men had no good map of the area, but did have a road map, which they used to identify the nearest towns so they could skirt well around them. They wanted to head north to Joshua's aunt's home, but didn't know if that would be a futile venture. Still, he had to go. He had to find out, but he was conflicted, torn between his idea that he should go north to his aunt, but also the beautiful girl to the south. He had known women before, beautiful women in fact, but this one was very different, and not just because of her religious beliefs. Something about her that he couldn't understand, could not put his finger on. He was intrigued. She was not the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, but why then couldn't he put her out of his thoughts? But for now, he had to. He had to focus. He and Clarence had decided to not follow Route 1 north, even though it would be shorter. It also appeared to have too many people, and people, they were quickly learning, could be dangerous and deadly. Butch had lost his life, although his attackers had paid dearly for it. The problem with a fight was even if you won, it always cost you something. They would avoid contact, avoid trouble, and try to move and use every tool and skill to their advantage. Their PBS 14 night vision goggles gave them the night. The PBS or starlight scopes used ambient light or existing light, and anyone could read a book with them. They were so advanced. Because of their high costs, they were not commonly in the hands of most civilians. At $3,000 for a good pair, he could see why, too. Now they would use this distinct advantage to aid them in getting to their destination. They would go near a town called Washburn in a couple of hours. If all went well, they would bivouac south of New Sweden. Hobos. Wind blew gently through the broken window of the control tower, rustling the still intact roll-up blind there a bit. Ox woke up from a good night's sleep, stretched, and was happy to smell coffee. Coffee had been found in one of the freight cars, an entire car of it, and why nobody had broken in was a pleasant mystery to them all. Outside and under a broken window on the tower, someone was making coffee on a fire from wooden pallets. Ox had chosen this building as the headquarters for the night. They would send patrols out looking, and as he scanned, he could see Mitchell going over rehearsals. He was glad to have the ranger along. He was always on with his tactical stuff. Ox used to hate men like him, always stressing operations orders, immediate action drills, and such. Now he was glad he had one and wished he had a lot more. The building he occupied was the most defensible one, but also gave him a view of the entire yard. He marveled at how complicated the mechanism was for controlling the shuttling of the trains. It could all be done by one person standing right here, provided there was electricity, of which they currently had none. Still, the large panel with its multicolored LEDs fascinated him, and he thought how it looked like a big train set. They had found plenty of fuel in the locomotive tanks still and pumped it out carefully and were topped off now. In fact, they had to leave several hundred gallons behind. There was no place to hold it. He was glad those fool looters weren't also burners like the ones around their last place. If the scouts found a lot of farming going on nearby, they might even stay here. It was a pretty good location, and it had potential, at least for Ox. The building even had a large, worn but comfortable leather couch for him to sleep on. The patrols would fan out on their bicycles and scan the immediate area for about 10 miles in any direction. On a bicycle, a person could easily cover this distance in an hour. On foot, it would take about 3. The genius of the bicycles pleased Ox, as he remembered stories of bicycle troops in World War II, how people scoffed at them for this, but then it dawned on him they didn't ride the bicycles into actual fighting. They merely transported themselves up to the staging areas, and it was a lot easier than walking there, that was for sure. Ox filled his canteen cup with the delicious brew and craved a drink. He had hoped they might find a car full of grain, perhaps corn, so that Shamron could make moonshine. If they had found such, he would definitely have chosen to stay at least long enough here to brew up a big batch. In the rail yard, they had found a few things of use, including some blankets, but not much else. More freight cars full of picked-over broken junk, televisions, computers, hopper cars full of plastic pellets, one full of nothing but patent leather belts with large red buckles. Amazing, Ox thought, a whole carload of them. But no food. Now the scouts would have to find something. Ox knew with this many people he had a formidable force. He also knew he had a formidable number of mouths to feed and provide for to keep things going. He wondered if he had too many people, but it was too late for that now. They would head north, past Mars Hill to Presque or even Caribou. It seemed the most logical place, too. Many people near Bangor to picked over. Returning to his perch in the tower, he lamented he would have to leave all this behind. He shouted out the window to Mitchell, who was talking to one of the recruits, and waved him up. Time to plan their move. He would have the recruits load this couch into the bus for him, too. The Return of the King. Linda, I know you're right, Leroy began, then seeing the look in her face added, I know I'm not ready, but I have to go. My friends and neighbors need me. Leroy's tone was as insistent as it was polite. She also knew that he was right, and this time she would not be able to order him back to bed. He was nearly healed up, and his wounds were still bad, but he could manage. He was tough, but sometimes tough and stupid are kissing cousins. All right, and against my better judgment, she stated, looking him sternly in the eye. Leroy, I need you to promise you will keep the wounds clean and not start doing heavy labor, just light stuff. He nodded, and she said, Steve and I are going to drive you back. Get some of the guard to go with us, too. This time of year it was getting more aggressive. The patrols had encountered numerous folks who wandered in. Some were hunting, others were scouting perhaps. Nobody could tell and didn't care to know. The policy was clear. If you had business in town, use the front door, so to speak, not the woods in the middle of the night. The Clarion had reported on a disease sweeping through the world now. Pockets of government were still operating, mostly at town level with a few county entities. The federal government was now broadcasting on the emergency band, and people were tuning in. Most people took it with a grain of salt. These were the same people, after all, who had eliminated the entire long-term survival apparatus once in place during the 50s and 60s for civil defense and replaced it with a 72-hour economy Band-Aid. Essentially, magic unicorns spraying fairy dust out of their rear ends to make everything better was a more believable idea than the gibberish currently being spouted by the government about recovery. Most disturbing, though, were reports of cannibalism that had become widespread during the winter months, especially near the cities. People far from the cities and the countryside were not as afflicted, especially those who knew how to raise their own food or those who had prepared for some sort of collapse. Still, nobody had predicted it would be as bad as this. Of one thing, though, the world was agreed. The collapse had been caused by the banking elites as they attempted the largest single theft of wealth in the entire history of the world. It had failed, though, because it was based upon a number of speculations and had created a panic that had exposed the fiat nature of the world's currency. It would be a long time, perhaps never, before people would trust to such a fraudulent method of banking as had been practiced so widely. Never again would they entrust a government to print money at will without proving it had some sort of backing behind it. I tried to talk Kevin into coming back to Washburn with me. We could use a strong hand, an extra sword, too. Linda smiled and their eyes met as he finished, but we both know why that isn't going to happen now, don't we? Linda laughed and said, I think I can come up with a couple of guesses, and one of them would be a pretty neighbor just up the hill. Yep, Leroy added. I reckon that would be exactly my guess, too. He paused before saying, I was glad to see them sitting in church together. These are hard times. They're different times. Linda remembered how the early pilgrims would lose spouses and would remarry rather quickly. They weren't encumbered by the artificiality that television and mass media brought. They were simple folk. Linda smiled and thought to herself, I guess we are the new pioneers. She went to find Steve so they could start arranging a patrol to take Leroy home. His heart felt a little sad, too, she could tell. He had become a part of their family, and Linda guessed this was part of getting old, because she was getting sentimental, too. She felt a little tear in her eye as she smiled and wiped it away. Leroy smiled at her and said, I'm going to miss you, too, Linda. Steve's a lucky man. Then, feeling he might have said a little too much, he headed to the barn to see if he could find Kevin. Darkness. I limped back to my rucksack and got my IFAK, or individual first aid kit, out. I used the medic scissors to cut open my trouser leg, half afraid to look. I saw a horrible gash that was bleeding profusely. It was not arterial, though. There were no telltale spurts of blood. Still, it was a nasty wound, and by my own knife, which angered me at myself. I wondered now what I had used it for last, hoping it wasn't too germ-infected. With shaking hands, I squirted betadine on it, soaking the entire area. I pulled out my Israeli bandage, tore it open with my teeth, and tied it down snug. My leg could bear weight, but I could not haul all that rucksack with me. I would have to cache some of it. If I were not injured, I would have run back through the woods to where I had dumped Greg's rucksack out, knowing he would be returning there to retrieve the things I had dumped and left behind. Instead, I went to the rock pile and, after several painful minutes, managed to retrieve my pistol. Next, I emptied out everything from my rucksack except my food, sleep system, and the weapons, caching the rest as best I could under some rocks. With no food inside and covered with rocks and leaves, I figured it would be safe from predators, both the 2- and 4-legged kind. My mind was fixed on this man. He was the incarnate of pure evil. His bragging about things, the way he spoke of things, unspeakable things, told me that the next time I saw this man, I would shoot him on sight. He was worse than a criminal. He was like a disease, a cancer that had to be dealt with before it spread. First, though, I had to get home. I had a nasty wound, and it could become fatal, could turn to gangrene. I would have to get it flushed out, and I would not do that in a stream, for the water there could have bacteria that would be worse than what I already knew was in there. I had to get within radio range, too. My leg would never carry me all the way home. I prayed I would get a break on radio transmission. I knew my friend Bill would be monitoring the net day and night, either personally or have someone on radio watch. Sometimes you get a break when there are clouds out. They actually help the transmission of your signal to skip a little further. Other times it seems to just swallow it up like the Bermuda Triangle. I walked nearly a mile before my leg hurt so badly I had to stop and lay down. I wished that my IFAK had at least one pain pill in it and lamented this oversight. Even a simple ibuprofen would have helped a bit. Exhausted and depressed from pain, I lay down with my legs slightly above my heart and was glad to see it had at least stopped bleeding. I contemplated removing the bandage, but then thought better of it. In darkness, I sat and thought. Looking up, I could see it was a clear night. I could see the beautiful stars shining through the canopy, and tried not to think about the man I had nearly been killed by. His stories of cruelty disturbed me. I knew that in desperate times people do desperate things and kill people for food, water, and other necessities. I knew that mobs rioted and did the same, caught up in the frenzy. This man killed for one of these reasons, but also he did it because he enjoyed it. I had heard of such men before, but to meet one face to face seemed to put a stain on my soul. The clear night meant there was no chance to skip my transmission back to the rear. I knew Bill would transmit a BTB or blind transmission broadcast out to me every 4 hours, starting at midnight, and tuned in to see if I could hear anything. All I got was a faint crackle and a garbled bit of noise. When it was done, I transmitted my general location where I was and my status. I did not give the specific location because these type radios were too easy to eavesdrop on. Anyone who heard it and thought to be clever and come around and look for a wounded, hungry man in the dark was a fool anyway, I reasoned. I also gave them a position about a half-mile away at the bridge over the mill stream. Anyone who come looking for me there I would hear or at least see. Right about now, though, I was wishing I had bought a pair of those PBS 14s. They were $3,000, and I had passed for that reason. I had a lot of other priorities. I pulled out my sleeping bag and hid myself under a bush and slept restlessly that night. I vowed to find this man and kill him, and that right soon, too. This has been Chapter 19 of the e-novel, survival novel, The Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. Tune in next Friday for Chapter 20.